Welcome to the Millennial Lawyer Podcast.
Welcome to the Millennial Lawyer Podcast with New York litigation attorney Mark Shirian. I'm Evan Mack, and I'm here with Mark Shirian to discuss the legal complexities surrounding sports injuries, whether they happen on the school field, at the gym, or during recreational play. How you doing after this incredible run by the Indiana Pacers? Let's get this started before we get started. How are you feeling? Are you going to be able to do this?
I've been better.
But before we get down to it, you guys, I think you guys are on the upswing, though. You guys are like on your way, right?
Hopefully, depending on some of the changes that might happen this offseason, we'll see. But I think the future's bright, not only for the Knicks, but for the Pacers, and we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Absolutely. All right. Let's get down to brass tacks. So what makes sports injury cases legally different from like a typical injury claim?
Sports injury cases are different because if you think about it, people are just having a good time. They're competing. These are high energy environments, but they have their own inherent risks. So unlike a car accident, courts expect athletes to accept some danger. So we focus on proving negligence, like faulty equipment or reckless coaching that goes beyond normal play.
Is it way more difficult? Is there a little more, details involved? You have to kind of like navigate it differently, even though based on what you just said?
It is difficult because when you talk about consent, and a lot of times you're not playing a sport by accident. You've consented to engaging in that sort of competition. And, with that, it comes with the assumption of the risk, depending on what the sport is. So I would say some sports are easier to prove than others, but every sport has some sort of inherent risk and an assumption of risk when you're engaging in that sport.
Can you break that down to the layman or the people that are watching, that assumption of risk in kind of just the detail behind that and what that actually means and how does it apply to athletic injury lawsuits?
Yeah, so assumption of risk means athletes consent to certain dangers. So like a tackle in football, but it's not a complete blank check. If a coach ignores safety protocols or a gym fails to maintain equipment, we can argue that the injury wasn't part of the game and is beyond the assumption of that risk. That's how you win a case with sports injuries.
Have you ever had any cases recently about anybody, any CTE things, any head things because of that new movement on, injuries from players playing football? Have you got any head injuries, anything coming across your board?
We haven't handled any of the CTE cases, but I will say that movie with Will Smith was a complete eye-opener because, but it is interesting because I think with that movie Concussion, I'm talking about the movie Concussion.
Yes.
You realize that a lot of these, unfortunately the NFL was concealing a lot of these studies with respect to CTE, and they didn't want that to get out. And obviously now in 2025, there's plenty of information out there where athletes can make that decision whether they want to partake in this type of sport or not, that unfortunately may cause head injuries and CTE and all that. But I think the difference between now and then is that then they didn't really have the information that they needed to make that decision. They didn't know how dangerous it was to engage in the sport. Now the information's out there, and you definitely assume that risk if you're engaging in a high impact sport like that. We haven't handled a CTE case, but we do have a case where a fellow was playing soccer at a soccer field in the Bronx, and there was a piece of cement within the soccer field, and he went to go kick the ball, and he hit this piece of cement. And it's our position that this should not have been within the soccer field, and that's outside of the scope of the assumption of risk.
Wow, that has to be. You're assuming risk, but you don't know you're going to kick a piece of concrete.
Exactly.
What I mean? That's wild. So when are liability waivers or release forms not legally enforceable?
Well, waivers aren't bulletproof. If the facility is grossly negligent, like ignoring known hazards or intentional misconduct, a lot of that times that goes beyond a general release. The other times we've seen that is for kids. Waivers signed by parents can sometimes be challenged as well. So it's not a complete, just because you signed a waiver doesn't mean you can't bring a lawsuit.
Are there distinct legal considerations for like youth sports compared to adult recreational leagues? Is it a kind of a different scope when it comes to that because of the age?
Yeah, absolutely. So youth sports involve stricter oversight because kids can't fully consent to risks. And schools and coaches have a higher duty to protect these kids, as opposed to adults engaging in sports. So that is a good question. And I would say that with kids, it becomes more of a higher duty to supervise those kids when they're engaging in sports, for sure.
Why do you think that is though? Because kids still want to engage in a sport. They're younger, but they still want to play. You know what I mean? Why is it strictly just because of their age? They don't have the same level of assumption of risk. Is it just because of age?
I think it's age, and also, kids don't necessarily know all the rules when it comes to a sport.
Mhm,
So having that extra oversight over kids is important because
mhm.
kids are more unpredictable than adults oftentimes. So
Well said. In your experience, what are the most common injuries that are litigated in sports law?
concussions, fractures, spinal injuries. Liability often falls on coaches for poor training, schools for unsafe fields, or even manufacturers for defective gears. So it depends on where the negligence lies. But a specific injury, I would say, obviously the orthopedic injuries you see more often than not when you're talking about kids getting injured playing sports.
Without going into too many specifics, do you have a case that you can remember that was like really difficult for you and your firm?
We had a case where we sued a university and a coach for being verbally abusive.
Interesting.
Not just verbally abusive, but it was a wrestling coach. It was a wrestling program. My client was a Division 1 wrestler, and the position was that the coach promoted a fight club culture, and it was a difficult case because I wrestled actually in college, and I coached
Wow.
wrestling at a private school on Long Island, an all boys school.
Wow.
So the question becomes, what is beyond what is expected in the sport of wrestling? So our
Mm,
allegation was that this coach created this fight club culture where wrestlers were fighting, and that was beyond the scope of wrestling. Because in layman terms, you can't punch during a wrestling match.
no,
So if the
no.
coach was promoting that sort of violence, which we were able to prove, then
Mhm.
that certainly is outside of what's expected. And like I said before, the assumption of risk when it comes to wrestling. So I would call it coach's malpractice, really,
Yeah.
where the coach is just not doing not doing a good job with respect to not doing what's expected with respect to a coach, because a coach has a lot of
Yeah.
responsibility and a lot of power and a lot of control. And
Absolutely.
as an athlete, you don't want to be insubordinate to the coach.
Absolutely.
And you know how it can get. So we see that a lot. That was one case that was difficult, but we were able to resolve it to everyone's liking. So
Yeah, if any athlete at any level, if you play any sport, we all know that power dynamic between coaches because you want to be, you know what I mean? You want to be liked, you want to get playing time, you want to be, you know what I mean? You want to be in good favor of the coach, and it's as a tough situation to be in when you're trying to just pursue a goal, pursue a dream.
absolutely, absolutely, it's important, and especially the college kids. The college, you're only in
Yes.
college once. With wrestling, not necessarily there's a professional future in that, but you're only in college once, and a lot of your friends are on the team as well. So it makes it even harder to complain and potentially bring a lawsuit against the university or the coaches or the school when your friends are also part of the program as well. So that's a very, you talk about challenging, that's a challenging dynamic as well, often.
Throughout your career, have you seen culture shift in sports? Because as I was growing up, like hazing and all these different things were commonplace. Not not keeping your mouth shut. Have you seen a culture shift for the better as you pursued cases?
That's a great question, and I'll tell you, I think that so with that wrestling example that I gave you, I actually had reached out to my wrestling coach in college at NYU.
Wow.
And because I wanted his opinion on the case and what was going on. And he told me, he's like, what this coach did was egregious. But he's like, I'll be honest with you. There are things that we said and did when you were a wrestler that we just couldn't do now. We couldn't say now. We have to speak to these athletes differently. We have to conduct ourselves differently now than we did when you were in school. So that's a really good question. Now, I'm very proud of the athletes now in that they're empowered to speak up about hazing, about abuse, about things that make them feel uncomfortable. I think that's great because when things happen in the dark and no one's talking about it, it's a silent killer, and you don't know how that's impacting them on the field and how it's affecting them off the field. So there has been a culture shift. I've heard that from coaches. Obviously, I'm not in the game in that capacity anymore, but I am seeing, and it with the NIL and everything, you see this athlete
Yes.
empowerment, and I think it's a great thing that athletes are empowered to speak up and to get paid what they're worth. I'm all about that. And there has definitely been a culture change. And I think it is for the better in most sense. Obviously, it's not all positive, but I think when it comes to reporting abuse and
Right.
holding schools accountable, I like what I'm seeing with the way things have shifted. So
That's
for
good to
sure.
hear. So what steps should an injured athlete family take immediately after an incident? Is there a time frame? What would you recommend them do?
I would say get medical attention immediately. First thing, even if it's a minor injury, because you don't know how that's going to develop. So first and
Wow.
foremost, get medical attention immediately. Then document the scene, photos, witness names. Don't sign anything from the facility. Call a lawyer fast to preserve evidence and protect your rights.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for tuning in to Millennial Lawyer Podcast with New York litigation attorney Mark Shirian. For more information, visit ShirianPC.com. Like, comment, subscribe, leave us a review, so you can get all this great information. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.